The B-17 Flying Fortress Memphis Belle shuddered violently as flak burst around her aluminum skin, each explosion sending shrapnel singing through the thin air at 25,000 feet above occupied France. Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen pressed his eye to the Norden bomb site, sweat freezing instantly on his forehead despite the heated flight suit. Below, the Messerschmitt factory stretched across the landscape like a gray scar, smoke already rising from the preliminary bombing runs. 30 seconds to target, Chen shouted into his throat microphone, his words crackling through the intercom system to the 9 other crew members scattered throughout the bomber's compartments. Wald glanced around the room at his colleagues from the Statistical Research Group, brilliant mathematicians who had been pulled from universities across America and tasked with applying their expertise to the most pressing problems of modern warfare. There was Dr. Leonard Jimmy Savage from the University of Michigan, his dark hair already showing streaks of premature gray from the stress of wartime calculations. Dr. Milton Friedman sat nearby, his sharp eyes fixed on the damage pattern charts with the same intensity he once brought to economic theory at Columbia. Dr. Frederick Mosteller from Harvard was scribbling notes in his characteristic shorthand, trying to capture every detail of Morrison's presentation. The room smelled of strong coffee, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar mixture of chalk dust and mimeograph ink that seemed to permeate every government building in wartime Washington. Outside, the sounds of a capital at war drifted through the windows, the distant rumble of aircraft engines, the clatter of military vehicles, the urgent conversations of people who knew that every day, every decision, every calculation could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The 8th Air Force is losing bombers at an unsustainable rate, Morrison continued, pointing to a series of graphs showing monthly losses. In the past 6 months alone, we've lost over 400 heavy bombers and nearly 4,000 trained aircrew. That's not counting the wounded, the shell-shocked, or those who've simply reached the psychological breaking point. Wald had seen these numbers before, but hearing them spoken aloud in the sterile environment of the conference room somehow made them more real, more devastating. Each number represented not just military hardware, but young men, boys really, most of them barely out of high school, who had volunteered to climb into aluminum coffins and fly into the teeth of the most sophisticated air defense system ever created. Morrison clicked a pointer against the wall chart. What you're looking at here is data from every bomber that's made it back to base over the past 3 months. We've cataloged every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every place where enemy fire has struck our aircraft. The pattern is clear. Certain areas of the aircraft are hit far more frequently than others. The pattern was indeed clear. The majority of the damage was concentrated in specific areas: the wings, the fuselage behind the bomb bay, the tail section. These areas were peppered with red dots, some so dense they overlapped. Other areas, the engines, the cockpit area, the fuel tanks, showed relatively little damage. The obvious solution, Morrison continued, is to add armor plating to the areas that are taking the most hits. Our engineers have calculated that we can add approximately 2,000 pounds of additional armor without severely compromising the aircraft performance. The question is where to put it. Dr. Savage leaned forward. Colonel, have you considered the weight distribution effects? Adding 2,000 pounds of armor could significantly alter the aircraft's center of gravity, potentially making them more difficult to handle, especially when damaged. We've run those calculations. The engineers assure us that proper distribution of the armor will minimize handling problems. The real question is placement. Logic suggests we should armor the areas taking the most hits. Wald had been silent throughout the presentation, his mind working through the problem from a different angle. Something about the colonel's conclusion bothered him, though he couldn't immediately articulate why.
He stood and walked closer to the damage pattern chart, studying the distribution of bullet holes with the methodical attention to detail that had made him one of the most respected statisticians in America. Abraham Wald's path to this moment had been anything but typical. Born in Cluj, then part of Austria-Hungary, he had grown up in a world where mathematical brilliance was both a blessing and a burden for a Jewish family living on the margins of European society. His father, a small-town baker, had recognized his son's extraordinary gift for numbers and had sacrificed enormously to provide him with an education.
Wald had excelled at the University of Vienna, studying under some of the most brilliant mathematical minds in Europe. His doctoral dissertation on geometry had been groundbreaking, but it was his work in mathematical statistics that had caught the attention of the American academic community. When the political situation in Europe became untenable for Jewish intellectuals, Wald had emigrated to the United States, accepting a position at Columbia University. The war had changed everything. Suddenly, abstract mathematical concepts had life-and-death applications. Wald had joined the Statistical Research Group not out of patriotism, though he was grateful to America for providing sanctuary, but out of a profound belief that mathematics could be used to preserve human life. Every equation he solved, every statistical model he developed could potentially save young men from death in the skies over Europe. "Colonel Morrison," Wald said, his slight Austrian accent still evident despite years in America, "may I ask a question about your data collection methodology?" "Certainly, Doctor." "These damage patterns represent only aircraft that returned to base, correct?" "That's right. We have detailed reports from every bomber that made it back to England over the past 3 months." Wald nodded slowly, his mind racing through the implications. "And the aircraft that didn't return, the ones shot down or that crashed, do we have damage data from those?" Morrison's expression grew puzzled. "Well, no. Obviously, we can't examine aircraft that were destroyed or fell behind enemy lines. We have some reports from surviving crew members who bailed out, but nothing systematic." "I see." Wald returned to his seat, but his mind remained focused on the fundamental flaw in the reasoning. The room fell silent as the other mathematicians watched their colleagues' thought process unfold. Dr. Friedman was the first to grasp the implications. "Abraham, are you suggesting that the damage pattern we're seeing is somehow biased?" "Not biased. Incomplete. We are examining only the aircraft that survived their missions. We are in effect studying successful damage patterns, areas where aircraft can be hit and still return home." The room erupted in conversation as the other mathematicians began to understand the implications. Dr. Savage grabbed a piece of paper and started sketching out the logical structure of the problem. Dr. Mosteller began calculating probabilities based on different assumptions about the missing data. Colonel Morrison, however, looked increasingly frustrated. "Dr. Wald, I'm afraid I don't follow your reasoning. If we want to protect our aircraft, surely we should armor the areas that are being hit most frequently." Wald walked back to the chart and pointed to the areas with few bullet holes, the engines, the cockpit, the fuel systems. "Colonel, what would happen if a bomber took a direct hit to its engines?" "It would likely crash or be forced to make an emergency landing behind enemy lines." "And if it took multiple hits to the fuel system?" "Fire, explosion, almost certain loss of aircraft and crew." "And if the pilot or co-pilot were killed by enemy fire?" Morrison's face began to change as he worked through the logic. "The aircraft would be uncontrollable. It would crash." "Precisely." Wald's voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of excitement as he explained his reasoning. "The aircraft we are examining, the ones that returned home, are precisely those that were not hit in the most critical areas. The damage patterns we are seeing represent areas where an aircraft can absorb punishment and still complete its mission." The room fell silent as the revolutionary implications sank in. They had been looking at the problem completely backwards. "You're saying
Dr. Savage said slowly, that we should armor the areas that show the least damage in our sample, because those are the areas where hits are fatal. Exactly. The areas showing heavy damage in our sample are areas where aircraft can be hit and still return home. The areas showing little or no damage are areas where hits are catastrophic, so catastrophic that the aircraft don't return for us to examine. Colonel Morrison stared at the chart with new eyes. The sparsely damaged areas, engines, cockpit, fuel systems, suddenly took on a completely different significance. These weren't areas that rarely got hit. These were areas where hits were so devastating that the aircraft never made it home to be counted. The revelation of survivorship bias sent shockwaves through the Statistical Research Group, but convincing the military establishment to completely reverse their armor placement strategy proved far more challenging than solving the mathematical problem itself. Word of Wald's analysis spread quickly through the corridors of the Pentagon, generating fierce debate among engineers, military tacticians, and procurement officers who had already begun planning for the armor modifications based on the original damage assessment. 3 days after the initial presentation, Dr. Wald found himself in the largest conference room in the War Department building, facing a panel of high-ranking officers and civilian engineers who represented months of planning and millions of dollars in projected modifications. The room was intimidating by design. Dark mahogany paneling, portraits of military heroes, and a massive table that seemed designed to dwarf anyone presenting to the assembled authorities. General Curtis LeMay sat at the head of the table, his expression skeptical and his patience clearly limited. LeMay had earned his reputation through aggressive leadership of bombing campaigns over Europe and Japan, and he was known for making decisions quickly and sticking to them regardless of opposition. To his right sat General Carl Spaatz, commander of strategic air forces in Europe, whose opinion could determine the fate of thousands of airmen. Scattered around the table were colonels, majors, and civilian contractors, all of whom had significant investments in the current armor placement strategy. Dr. Wald, General LeMay began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. I understand you're proposing that we completely reverse our armor placement strategy based on what you call survivorship bias. I'll be frank with you, this sounds like academic theory getting in the way of practical military necessity. Wald had prepared for this resistance. He understood that military culture valued decisive action and concrete results, and his statistical arguments would need to be translated into terms that resonated with combat veterans who had seen too many young men die. Dr. Wald, may I begin with a simple thought experiment? Wald asked, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. LeMay nodded curtly. Imagine that you have 2 types of aircraft, Wald said, moving to a blackboard and sketching 2 simple airplane silhouettes. Type A aircraft have armor protecting their engines and fuel systems, but none on their wings or tail sections. Type B aircraft have heavy armor on their wings and tail sections, but no protection for engines or fuel systems. He turned to face the panel. Now, General, which type of aircraft would you expect to see more frequently returning to base with battle damage? General Spaatz leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. The ones with wing and tail armor, Type A. The ones without engine protection would be shot down more frequently. Exactly, Wald replied. And if you examined only the aircraft that returned to base, what pattern of damage would you observe? The room fell silent as the officers worked through the logic. Colonel Morrison spoke first, who had become a convert to Wald's analysis. You'd see heavy damage to the wings and tail sections of the Type A aircraft, the areas that weren't armored. The Type B aircraft would show little damage because they wouldn't make it home to be examined.
Which brings us to the fundamental error in our current assessment, Wald continued. We are examining battle damage on aircraft that survived their missions. By definition, these aircraft were not hit in areas that would have been fatal. The areas showing little damage in our sample are not areas that enemy fighters avoid. They are areas where enemy hits are so devastating that the aircraft don't return for examination. General LeMay's expression remains skeptical. Dr. Wald, that's an interesting theory, but theories don't win wars. Results do. We have concrete data showing where our aircraft are being hit, and we need to protect those areas. General, may I share some additional data that supports this analysis? Wald had anticipated this objection and had spent the previous 2 days working with the Statistical Research Group to develop supporting evidence. Dr. Friedman, who had accompanied Wald to the meeting, stood and distributed a series of charts to the panel members. We've analyzed the data differently, focusing on mission outcome correlations. When we examine aircraft that suffered heavy damage to wings and tail sections, their survival rate is quite high. Approximately 87% make it back to base. However, when we look at the limited data we have from aircraft that suffered engine damage, information from surviving crew members who bailed out or made emergency landings, the survival rate drops to less than 15%. Colonel Harrison Wright, the Chief Procurement Officer, raised his hand. Dr. Friedman, how much data do we actually have on aircraft that didn't return? Your sample size for engine damage seems quite small. You're absolutely right, Colonel Wright, Friedman acknowledged. We have limited direct data on aircraft that didn't return, which is precisely why the survivorship bias is so dangerous. We're making decisions based on incomplete information. Dr. Savage presented the next set of evidence. We've also analyzed German tactical documents captured from shot-down Luftwaffe pilots. Their training manuals specifically emphasize targeting engines, fuel systems, and cockpit areas. German fighter pilots are trained to focus on what they call Todesstoß targets, death blow targets that will bring down bombers with minimal ammunition expenditure. This caught General LeMay's attention. Where did you get these documents? Through Army intelligence, Savage replied. The Germans have studied our aircraft vulnerabilities extensively. Their tactical doctrine assumes that hits to wings and tail sections are unlikely to bring down a bomber immediately, so they focus on critical systems. General Spaatz studied the German documents with obvious interest. This aligns with pilot reports from our fighter escorts. German fighters consistently attempt to attack bombers from angles that give them clear shots at engines and cockpit areas. The mood in the room was shifting, but the practical obstacles to implementing Wald's recommendations remained substantial. Colonel Harrison Wright outlined the challenges. Even if Dr. Wald's analysis is correct, we're talking about completely reversing our armor placement strategy. We've already begun manufacturing wing and fuselage armor plates. Retooling to produce engine armor and reinforced fuel systems would require months of development and testing. How many bombers are we losing per month to combat damage? Wald consulted. Morrison consulted his reports. Current combat losses average 127 aircraft per month across all theaters. And how many crew members does that represent? Approximately 1,270 men per month, assuming average crew sizes.
We are discussing the difference between protecting areas where aircraft can absorb damage and still return home versus protecting areas where single hits are fatal. If our analysis is correct, proper armor placement could reduce combat losses by 40 to 60%. General LeMay looked up from the German tactical documents. Dr. Wald, if you're right, we're talking about saving 500 to 700 aircrew lives per month. That's a conservative estimate, General. The cumulative effect over the remainder of the war could be thousands of lives. The room fell silent as the officers contemplated the human cost of their decision. These were not abstract numbers to men who had signed letters of condolence to the families of young airmen who would never return home. Dr. Mosteller presented the final piece of evidence, a statistical projection based on different armor placement strategies. We've run Monte Carlo simulations based on various assumptions about hit probability and damage effectiveness. In every scenario, protecting critical systems produces better survival rates than protecting areas that show heavy damage in our current sample. General Spaatz was the first senior officer to speak. Dr. Wald, the
assuming your analysis is correct, what would you recommend as our next steps? We need to test the hypothesis with limited field implementation, Wald replied. I propose armoring a small number of aircraft according to our recommendations and comparing their survival rates to aircraft with conventional armor placement. Colonel Wright shook his head. A controlled test would take months to produce statistically significant results. We don't have that kind of time. Then we need to make a decision based on the evidence we have, General LeMay said, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. Dr. Wald, I want you to work with our engineering teams to develop specific armor placement recommendations. Colonel Wright, I want to know exactly what it will take to implement these changes and how quickly we can do it. The general stood, signaling the end of the formal meeting. Gentlemen, we're gambling with the lives of American airmen either way. The question is whether we bet on visible damage patterns or on mathematical analysis that tells us the areas we can't see are the ones we need to protect. As the officers filed out of the room, Dr. Wald remained behind with his colleagues from the Statistical Research Group. The battle to convince military leadership had been won, but the real challenge, translating statistical analysis into engineering solutions that would save lives over the skies of Europe, was just beginning. The Boeing Aircraft Company's modification center in Wichita, Kansas, had been transformed into a hive of urgent activity following the Pentagon's decision to implement Dr. Wald's armor placement recommendations. What had begun as a theoretical statistical analysis now faced the harsh reality of engineering constraints, manufacturing limitations, and the relentless pressure of wartime production schedules. Chief Engineer Robert Patterson stood in the center of the vast factory floor, surrounded by the skeletal frameworks of B-17 flying fortresses in various stages of modification. The familiar sounds of wartime production, the rhythmic hammering of riveting guns, the whine of metal saws, and the shouted communications between work crews created a symphony of urgent purpose that had become the soundtrack of American industrial mobilization.
Patterson was a veteran of aircraft design who had worked on everything from the first Boeing 247 airliners to the massive B-29 superfortresses that were just entering service in the Pacific Theater. At 45, he possessed the perfect combination of engineering brilliance and practical experience that made him invaluable to the war effort. But the challenge presented by Wald's statistical analysis was unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of aircraft design. The fundamental problem, Patterson explained to his assembled team of engineers, is that Dr. Wald's recommendations require us to armor areas that were never designed to carry additional weight. The engines, fuel systems, and cockpit areas are structurally integrated into the aircraft in ways that make armor installation extremely complex. The team gathered around Patterson represented some of the most talented aeronautical engineers in America, pooled from aircraft manufacturers and universities to work on the most pressing technical challenges of the war. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women engineers working on military aircraft, had been recruited from MIT, where she had been studying advanced materials applications. Dr. James Harrison came from the California Institute of Technology, where his research on aircraft structural dynamics had revolutionized understanding of how aircraft responded to combat damage. Let's start with the engine armor problem, Patterson continued, pointing to a detailed cutaway diagram of a B-17's wing section. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines are mounted on relatively delicate engine mounts that were designed to carry the weight and vibration of the engine itself, plus fuel and oil systems. Adding significant armor protection could overstress these mounting points, potentially leading to catastrophic engine failure even without combat damage. Sarah Mitchell studied the engineering drawings with a methodical attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected materials engineers on the team. "What's the weight budget we're working with?" she asked. Dr. Wald's analysis suggests that effective protection of critical areas would require approximately 1,800 pounds of additional armor per aircraft. That's distributed among engine nacelles,
fuel system protection, and reinforced cockpit areas. Dr. Harrison looked up from his calculations. 1,800 pounds represents a 7% increase in empty weight for a B-17. That's going to have significant effects on performance. Reduced payload, shorter range, higher fuel consumption, and most critically, a lower service ceiling that puts the aircraft within range of additional German anti-aircraft systems. The engineering challenges were compounded by the urgency of implementation. Every day of delay meant more bomber crews flying with inadequate protection over increasingly dangerous targets. The German air defense system was becoming more sophisticated monthly, with new radar-directed flak systems and improved fighter tactics that made bombing missions even more hazardous. "We need to think creatively about materials and placement," Mitchell suggested. "Traditional steel armor plating may not be the optimal solution. Have we considered advanced ceramics or layered composite systems?" Patterson nodded. "We've been in contact with materials science teams at several universities. There are promising developments in ceramic armor systems that could provide equivalent protection at 40% of the weight of steel plating. The problem is manufacturing time and cost."
The team spent the next several hours working through various engineering solutions, each presenting its own set of challenges and compromises. Engine armor required completely redesigned nacelles that could distribute weight loads without interfering with airflow or maintenance access. Fuel system protection needed to account for the complex routing of fuel lines throughout the aircraft while ensuring that armor didn't create fire hazards or interfere with fuel management systems. The cockpit protection presented perhaps the most complex challenge. The pilot and co-pilot positions were surrounded by critical flight controls, instrument panels, and structural elements that couldn't be modified without extensive testing. Traditional armor installation would require moving or redesigning dozens of essential aircraft systems. "What about a modular approach?" Dr. Harrison suggested. "Instead of trying to retrofit existing aircraft with integrated armor systems, what if we develop armor kits that can be installed at forward bases? Simplified systems that provide critical protection without requiring major structural modifications." Mitchell began sketching out the concept. Bolt-on engine armor panels, removable fuel system protection, reinforced pilot seats with integral armor. It wouldn't provide the same level of protection as integrated design, but it could be implemented quickly with minimal aircraft downtime. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Morrison, who had flown directly from Washington to assess the engineering progress. His expression was grim as he surveyed the complexity of the modification work underway. "Gentlemen, Ms. Mitchell," Morrison began, "I need to give you an update on the tactical situation in Europe. German fighter tactics are evolving rapidly in response to our bombing campaigns. Intelligence reports indicate that they're concentrating their most experienced pilots in specialized bomber-killer units equipped with aircraft specifically modified for anti-bomber operations." Patterson looked up from the engineering drawings. "What kind of modifications, Colonel?" "Heavier armament, primarily. Focke-Wulf 190s with additional 20mm cannons, Messerschmitt 110s with 37mm anti-tank guns, even some experimental aircraft with 50mm cannons designed specifically for bringing down heavy bombers. The level of firepower these units can bring to bear is unprecedented." The implications were sobering. The armor systems they were developing would need to protect against much heavier weapons than originally anticipated. What had begun as protection against rifle-caliber machine guns and small cannon shells now needed to address direct hits from weapons capable of destroying tanks. "Colonel, that changes our weight and protection requirements significantly," Mitchell said. "Protection against 37mm and 50mm cannons requires armor thickness that could easily add 3,000 pounds or more to each aircraft. Which brings us to an uncomfortable reality. We may need to accept that some aircraft will be optimized for different mission profiles. High-altitude precision bombing might require maximum armor protection, while low-level tactical missions might prioritize speed and maneuverability over survivability." Dr. Harrison was already working through the mathematical implications. "We're talking about developing multiple armor configurations based on mission requirements. That multiplies our engineering challenges exponentially."
"But it might be the only practical solution," Patterson acknowledged. Rather than trying to create one armor system that handles all threats, we developed specialized protection packages for specific mission types. The team worked through the evening, developing a comprehensive plan that balanced Dr. Wald's statistical recommendations with the harsh realities of engineering constraints and manufacturing limitations. Their solution involved 3 different armor packages: a lightweight system for routine bombing missions, a medium system for heavily defended targets, and a maximum protection system for the most dangerous missions. Each system would protect the critical areas identified by Wald's analysis: engines, fuel systems, and crew positions, while maintaining aircraft performance within acceptable limits. The modular design would allow for rapid installation and removal at forward bases, providing tactical flexibility while minimizing the engineering complexity of permanent modifications. As the night wore on, Patterson realized that they were not just solving an engineering problem, they were creating a new philosophy of aircraft survivability that would influence military aviation for decades to come. Dr. Wald's statistical analysis had identified the critical vulnerabilities, but translating that knowledge into practical protection systems required a complete rethinking of how military aircraft were designed and equipped. The work continued past midnight, with engineers, material specialists, and manufacturing experts collaborating on solutions that would soon be tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable, the skies over Nazi Germany, where young American airmen would discover whether mathematics and engineering could indeed provide an invisible shield against the machinery of war.
Davies handed Anderson a sealed packet. Post-mission analysis procedures. The data from today's flight will be transmitted directly to Dr. Wald's team in Washington. Their analysis will determine whether we proceed with full-scale armor implementation or modify the design. The weight of responsibility was not lost on Anderson. 10 men would climb into the experimental bomber, trusting that mathematical analysis and engineering expertise would protect them better than the conventional armor placement that had been standard for months. If Dr. Wald's analysis was wrong, if the engineers had made critical errors, if the test revealed unforeseen problems, the consequences would be immediate and potentially fatal. Anderson's crew had been briefed on the test program and had volunteered to participate despite the unknowns involved. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan, the flight engineer, had spent hours studying the modified aircraft systems to understand how the armor changes affected aircraft operation. Staff Sergeant David Chen, the bombardier, had worked with engineers to ensure that the additional weight didn't interfere with bombing accuracy. Each crew member understood that they were not just flying another combat mission. They were testing a system that could affect the survival of thousands of Allied airmen. The target for the test mission was a ball bearing factory in Schweinfurt, Germany, one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Nazi Europe. The facility was protected by multiple flak batteries, early warning radar systems, and fighter squadrons specifically trained for bomber interception. If Dr. Wald's armor placement could protect aircraft over Schweinfurt, it would work anywhere. At 0600 hours, Anderson and his crew completed their pre-flight inspection and climbed aboard the modified B-17. The aircraft felt subtly different during engine start and taxi procedures. The additional armor weight affected the aircraft's balance and required slight adjustments to normal operating procedures. The engines seemed to work harder during takeoff, and the aircraft required a longer takeoff roll to reach flying speed. Once airborne, however, the differences were less noticeable. The B-17 climbed steadily towards its assigned altitude of 25,000 feet, taking its position in the larger formation of 312 bombers heading toward targets across Nazi Germany. To German radar operators and fighter controllers, Anderson's aircraft was indistinguishable from the standard bombers surrounding it, but the men inside knew they were flying with protection designed specifically for the areas where enemy hits were most likely to be fatal. The flight across the English Channel and over occupied France proceeded normally, with only routine radio traffic between aircraft and occasional course corrections to avoid known flak concentrations.
Anderson used the time to familiarize himself with how the modified aircraft handled at different airspeeds and altitudes, noting that the armor weight had minimal effect on normal flight operations. The first test of Dr. Wald's analysis came sooner than expected. At 0847 hours, approximately 50 miles from the target, German radar installations detected the approaching bomber formation and scrambled fighter squadrons from 3 different airfields. The Luftwaffe response was swift and coordinated. MAG-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbing rapidly to intercept the bombers before they could reach their target. Fighters, 2 o'clock high, called out Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez from the ball turret position. Looks like a full squadron, climbing fast. Anderson acknowledged the warning and began the standard evasive maneuvers, but formation flying limited his options for avoiding combat. The German fighters would have to be fought off by the combined firepower of the bomber formation and their P-51 Mustang escort. The attack came with textbook precision. The German fighters approached from the sun, using their altitude advantage to build up speed before diving toward the bomber formation. Their target selection was methodical. They focused on aircraft at the edges of the formation, where defensive firepower was reduced and escape routes were limited. Anderson's aircraft was flying in the vulnerable Purple Heart corner position at the low right edge of the formation when the German fighters began their attack runs. The first burst of cannon fire came from a Focke-Wulf 190 diving from 10,000 feet above, its 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns creating a devastating cone of fire. The 20mm cannon shells from the Focke-Wulf 190 struck Anderson's B-17 with devastating precision. 3 rounds punched through the port wing, another shattered the plexiglass nose cone, and 2 more slammed into the No. 2 engine nacelle with metallic crashes that reverberated throughout the aircraft.
"Engine 2 is hit," Technical Sergeant O'Sullivan shouted over the intercom, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature climbing." Anderson fought to maintain control as the aircraft shuddered under the impact of German cannon fire. This was the moment of truth. Would Dr. Wald's armor placement protect the critical systems, or would statistical theory prove inadequate against the reality of combat? The engine continued running. Despite taking direct hits to the nacelle, the specially placed armor had deflected the cannon rounds away from the engine's critical components. The oil lines remained intact, the fuel system was undamaged, and the engine mounts held firm despite the tremendous impact forces. "Engine 2 is staying online," O'Sullivan reported, his voice filled with amazement. "The armor worked. Those shells would have torn right through a standard engine mount." The German fighter attack continued for another 12 minutes, with Anderson's aircraft absorbing multiple hits to various areas. When the P-51 Mustang escorts finally drove off the attackers, the experimental B-17 had been struck by no fewer than 17 cannon rounds and countless machine gun bullets. Under normal circumstances, such damage would have been catastrophic. Instead, the aircraft continued toward its target, all 4 engines running, all critical systems operational. The areas that had absorbed the heaviest damage, wings, tail section, rear fuselage, were precisely the locations where Dr. Wald's analysis had predicted aircraft could sustain hits and survive. The armored critical areas had protected the engine, fuel system, and crew positions that would have meant certain death if penetrated. Dr. Abraham Wald stood in the same conference room where he had first presented his survivorship bias analysis, but the atmosphere was completely different. The walls were now covered with detailed reports from the first month of combat testing, photographs of battle-damaged aircraft, and statistical analyses that confirmed what many had hoped but few had dared to believe. Colonel Morrison presented the results to an audience that included the same generals who had initially been skeptical of mathematical solutions to military problems. General LeMay, General Spaatz, and a dozen other senior officers studied the data with the intensity of men who understood that numbers on a chart represented the lives of young Americans flying over Nazi Europe. "The results are unprecedented," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of vindication.
Over the past 30 days, we've flown 247 test missions using aircraft modified according to Dr. Wald's armor placement recommendations. The survival weight for these aircraft is 94.3%, compared to 78.6% for aircraft with conventional armor placement flying similar missions. General Spots looked up from the detailed damage reports. That represents a 20% improvement in survival rates. In practical terms, that means 40 fewer aircraft lost per month, approximately 400 fewer casualties. The improvement is even more dramatic when we examine aircraft that took heavy combat damage, Dr. Friedman added, presenting additional analysis. Of the test aircraft that absorbed significant enemy fire, 89% returned to base with repairable damage. The comparable figure for conventionally armored aircraft is 61%. The photographs told the story more vividly than any statistical analysis could. Image after image showed aircraft that had absorbed tremendous punishment but continued flying because the hits had struck areas where the aircraft could absorb damage rather than critical systems protected by Dr. Wald's armor placement strategy. Anderson's aircraft had become the most documented case study. His B-17 had absorbed 31 separate hits during its test mission to Schweinfurt, including 7 direct strikes to areas that would normally have caused catastrophic failure. The engine armor had deflected cannon rounds that would have severed oil lines and fuel connections. The reinforced fuel system had contained a fire that would have destroyed a conventional aircraft. The crew protection had saved the navigator's life when shrapnel from a near-miss flak burst would have been fatal.
The Boeing Modification Center in Wichita had been transformed into the epicenter of a manufacturing revolution that would affect every heavy bomber rolling off American production lines. What had begun as an experimental armor installation program had evolved into a complete reimagining of how military aircraft were designed and protected. Chief Engineer Patterson stood before a massive production chart that tracked the implementation of Dr. Wald's armor placement recommendations across the entire U.S. bomber fleet. The numbers were staggering. Over 2,000 aircraft had been modified in the past 3 months, with production rates increasing weekly as manufacturing techniques improved and supply chains adapted to the new requirements. "We've reduced installation time from 42 hours per aircraft to 16 hours, Patterson reported to the assembled production managers and military liaisons. The modular armor system allows for rapid installation at forward bases, and we've developed 3 different protection packages based on mission requirements." Sarah Mitchell had been promoted to Chief Materials Engineer and was leading the development of advanced armor systems that pushed the boundaries of metallurgy and composite materials. Her team had created ceramic steel composite armor that provided 40% better protection at 30% less weight than conventional steel plating. The next-generation armor systems will incorporate lessons learned from the first 6 months of combat testing, Mitchell explained, pointing to advanced materials samples displayed on the conference table. "We're seeing protection levels that would have been impossible with traditional materials, and weight penalties that are actually lower than our original conventional armor installations." The manufacturing challenge had required innovations that extended far beyond armor placement. Engine mounts had been redesigned to distribute armor weight more effectively. Fuel systems had been completely reimagined to provide better protection while maintaining operational efficiency. Crew positions had been reconfigured to maximize protection without compromising operational effectiveness. Dr. Harrison's structural analysis team had solved the weight distribution problems that had initially seemed insurmountable. Through careful engineering and advanced materials, they had actually improved aircraft performance while dramatically increasing survivability. The modified aircraft are not just more survivable, they're actually more stable in flight, have better handling characteristics under combat conditions, and require less maintenance than the original designs. We've accidentally created better aircraft while trying to solve the survivorship bias problem. Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen completed his 50th combat mission over Nazi Germany on a cold February morning in 1945, landing his B-17 at RAF Bassingbourn,
with the quiet satisfaction of a bombardier who had seen his mathematical training contribute to something larger than equations and calculations. Chen's aircraft bore the scars of 50 missions, patched bullet holes, repaired structural damage, and the accumulated wear of months spent in the most dangerous airspace in the world. But the aircraft had brought him home every time, and Chen understood that his survival was directly connected to the mathematical analysis of a soft-spoken Austrian refugee whom he had never met. The human dimension of Dr. Wald's work had become apparent in countless individual stories. Pilot Robert Morgan of the Memphis Belle had completed his 25th mission and returned to the United States for a war bond tour, but not before flying 12 missions in aircraft modified according to Wald's recommendations. His survival through missions over some of the most heavily defended targets in Europe had depended on armor placement determined by statistical analysis rather than conventional wisdom. Navigation Officer James Patterson, no relation to the Boeing engineer, had survived a direct hit from a German 37mm cannon that struck his aircraft's No. 3 engine during a mission over Berlin. The specially designed engine armor had contained the explosion and prevented fuel system rupture that would have destroyed the aircraft within seconds. Patterson completed his tour and returned home to marry his high school sweetheart, never knowing that his survival had been determined by mathematical analysis of bullet holes in aircraft that had managed to return from previous missions.
Ball turret gunner Michael Rodriguez had been wounded by shrapnel during a fighter attack over Hamburg, but the reinforced crew protection had prevented what would have been fatal injuries under the conventional armor placement. Rodriguez recovered from his wounds and returned to combat operations, eventually completing 47 missions before the war's end. The statistics were impressive, but the individual stories were what gave meaning to Dr. Wald's work. Every mission that ended with aircrew walking away from their aircraft represented a victory not just of engineering and manufacturing, but of clear thinking applied to problems where conventional wisdom had been not just wrong, but deadly. Dr. Abraham Wald's insights into survivorship bias extended far beyond armor placement on military aircraft. By the spring of 1945, the Statistical Research Group was applying the same analytical principles to problems ranging from convoy routing to weapons effectiveness analysis. And the implications were transforming military planning across all theaters of operation. The fundamental insight that examining only successful cases provides an incomplete and potentially misleading picture had applications in virtually every aspect of military operations. Naval planners began analyzing submarine attack patterns by focusing on the attacks that had failed rather than those that had succeeded. Intelligence analysts started examining German defensive strategies by studying the battles where German forces had been defeated rather than their victories. Dr. Friedman had been assigned to analyze the effectiveness of different bombing strategies using Wald's survivorship bias framework. We had been studying successful bombing missions to determine optimal tactics, Friedman explained to a joint planning conference at the Pentagon. But the missions that achieved their objectives told us nothing about why other missions failed. When we started analyzing failed missions, aircraft that were shot down, targets that weren't hit, formations that were broken up by fighter attacks, we discovered completely different patterns. The analysis revealed that successful bombing missions often succeeded despite using suboptimal tactics, while failed missions provided clear evidence of what didn't work under combat conditions. This led to tactical innovations that improved bombing accuracy while reducing losses, changes that might never have been discovered by studying only successful operations. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. But the impact of Dr. Wald's work continued to influence military aviation for decades to come. The armor placement principles developed through survivorship bias analysis became standard for all military aircraft, and the analytical framework was applied to civilian aviation safety, automotive design, and industrial safety systems. Captain Anderson flew his final combat mission on May 5, 1945, 3 days before the German surrender. His aircraft,
The same experimental B-17 that had tested Dr. Wald's initial armor placement recommendations had completed 67 combat missions without a single crew fatality. The aircraft was eventually retired to a museum where it stands today as a testament to the power of mathematical analysis applied to life and death problems. Dr. Wald returned to Columbia University after the war, where he continued his groundbreaking work in mathematical statistics. His wartime experience had convinced him that mathematical analysis could address practical problems in ways that conventional approaches often missed. He continued to publish influential research until his death in 1950, but his work on survivorship bias remained his most widely known contribution to both mathematics and human welfare. The Statistical Research Group was disbanded with the end of the war, but its members went on to influential careers in academia, government, and industry. Dr. Friedman became one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Dr. Savage advanced the field of decision theory, and Dr. Mosteller pioneered the use of statistical analysis in medical research. The principles discovered by Dr. Abraham Wald continue to influence decision-making in fields ranging from medical research to financial analysis, from engineering design to business strategy. The fundamental insight that visible failures often provide more useful information than visible successes has become a cornerstone of evidence-based decision-making across countless disciplines. Modern aircraft design still incorporates the armor placement principles developed through Wald's analysis, though the threats have evolved from cannon fire to missile attacks, and the armor has advanced from steel plating to sophisticated composite materials and electronic countermeasures. But the analytical framework remains unchanged. Protect the areas where hits are fatal rather than the areas where hits are visible.
In medical research, survivorship bias awareness has led to more effective treatments for diseases ranging from cancer to heart disease. Researchers now understand that studying only patients who survive treatment provides an incomplete picture of treatment effectiveness, and that examining treatment failures often provides more useful information for improving patient outcomes. Business strategists have applied Wald's insights to everything from product development to market analysis. Companies that study their failures more carefully than their successes often discover opportunities and threats that would otherwise remain invisible. The businesses that fail provide more useful information about market conditions than the businesses that succeed, just as aircraft that were shot down provided more useful information about armor placement than aircraft that returned home. Financial analysts use survivorship bias awareness to evaluate investment strategies more accurately. Mutual funds that have been discontinued due to poor performance provide more useful information about investment risks than funds that have survived and prospered. The failures tell the story that the successes cannot, which strategies work under adverse conditions and which only work when market conditions are favorable. The story of the invisible shield began with bullet holes in aluminum aircraft 30,000 feet above Nazi Europe, but it reveals a fundamental truth about how we perceive and respond to danger in all aspects of human experience. Dr. Abraham Wald's insight that we must examine what we cannot see to understand what we can observe has applications that extend far beyond military aviation. Every day, in countless situations, we make decisions based on incomplete information. We see the successes and assume they represent the optimal approach. We observe the survivors and conclude they represent the best strategy. We examine the visible damage and assume it represents the greatest threat. Dr. Wald's analysis reminds us that the most critical information is often hidden from view, not because it is deliberately concealed, but because the most important failures eliminate themselves from our sample. The aircraft that might have taught us the most about survivability were shot down over Europe and never returned to tell their stories. The businesses that might teach us the most about market conditions disappeared without a trace.
The patients, who might teach us the most about treatment effectiveness, died before their cases could be documented. The invisible shield that protected Allied airmen was created not by adding armor where damage was visible, but by understanding that the absence of damage in certain areas indicated not that those areas were safe, but that damage in those areas was fatal. The mathematics of survival required looking beyond the obvious to understand the hidden patterns that determine life and death. In our own lives, the same principle applies. The path to safety, success, and survival often requires us to pay attention to what we cannot see rather than what we can observe. The failures that disappear from view may provide more useful guidance than the successes that remain visible. The problems that eliminate themselves from our sample may be more important than the problems that persist long enough to be studied. Dr. Abraham Wald never flew in a combat aircraft, never felt the terror of watching German fighters diving toward his formation, never experienced the relief of landing safely after a mission over occupied territory. But his mathematical analysis saved thousands of young men who did experience those things, protecting them with an invisible shield created from pencil marks on paper, and the revolutionary insight that sometimes what we cannot see is more important than what we can observe. The bullet holes in the aircraft that returned home told one story, where aircraft could be hit and still survive. But the real story, the story that saved lives, was written by the aircraft that never made it home, the failures that eliminated themselves from the sample, the invisible evidence that taught Dr. Wald where protection was most desperately needed.
In the end, the invisible shield was not made of steel or aluminum or ceramic composites, though all of those materials played their role. The invisible shield was made of clear thinking, applied to incomplete data, mathematical analysis that looked beyond the obvious, and the understanding that survival often depends on protecting against threats that cannot be directly observed. The young men who flew home safely in aircraft protected by Dr. Wald's armor placement never saw the shield that protected them. They saw only the mission completed, the target destroyed, the formation intact, the landing gear touching down on English soil one more time. The invisible shield did its work silently, deflecting death away from critical systems, preserving life through the application of mathematical principles to the harsh realities of aerial combat. But the shield remains visible to us decades later in the form of analytical principles that continue to save lives in countless applications. Every time a medical researcher accounts for survivorship bias in clinical trials, every time an engineer designs safety systems by analyzing failures rather than successes, every time a decision-maker looks beyond visible evidence to understand hidden patterns, Dr. Abraham Wald's invisible shield continues its work. The war ended more than 75 years ago, but the mathematics of survival continues to protect us in ways we seldom recognize. The invisible shield surrounds us still, created not from metal and composites, but from the understanding that the most important truths are often hidden in the evidence we cannot see, the stories we cannot hear, and the failures that eliminate themselves from our view before we have the chance to learn from them. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of the most fascinating stories in the history of statistics, engineering, and human survival. This tale of Dr. Abraham Wald and the invisible shield demonstrates how mathematical thinking can literally be the difference between life and death. If this story captivated you as much as it did me, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who would appreciate this remarkable piece of history. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive historical narratives. In the comments below, let me know what aspect of this story resonated most with you. Was it the mathematical breakthrough, the engineering challenges, or the human stories of the aircrew who benefited from Dr. Wald's analysis? I read every comment,
and love hearing your thoughts on these historical tales. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in what we cannot see, and that clear thinking applied to difficult problems can create shields that protect us in ways we might never recognize. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.